Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Unearthing New Zealand's Constitutional Traditions Conference. Yesterday we had a very stimulating day, and today it promises to be no different. My name is Colón-Ríos. I am a senior lecturer in law at Victoria University of Wellington. We are very happy and honored today to have Professor David Hackett Fischer as the Law Foundation keynote speaker. David Hackett Fischer is professor of history and Earl professor of history, at Brandeis University. He's best known for two main works, Albion's Seat and Washington's Crossing. In Washington's Crossing, which examines the leadership of George Washington during the American Revolutionary War, for that book, Professor Fischer was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. More recently, he published a book titled Fairness and Freedom, in which he engaged in a comparative history of New Zealand and the United States. Although these two societies have many things in common, they are of course different in important ways. And what made them different, according to Professor Fischer, is that they have been guided by different principles. Freedom in the case of the United States and fairness in the case of New Zealand. And through the book, Professor Fischer explores the multiple causes for those divergences. For example, he maintains that the fact that North America was settled in the 17th century, during a time in which Great Britain experienced different moments of absolute government, had an important influence or impact in the way in which North American settlers valued freedom. But by the time New Zealand was settled, the threat of absolutism and lack of freedom had subsided in Great Britain, and instead questions about fairness and justice had assumed a central role. So it was only natural that New Zealand settlers, in their own ways, attempted to create a society guided by the ideal of fairness. But of course, freedom and fairness are only ideals. That is to say, not only they cannot be fully realized, but they are in fact frequently negated in actual social, political, and constitutional practice. As someone interested in constitutional reform and constitution making, Professor Fischer's historical work made me think about what kind of constitutional arrangement, if any, would get New Zealand as close as possible to that strong tradition of fairness. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Hackett Fischer.
Kia ora, tatu. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. Thanks, Joel, for that introduction. Thanks to Claudia for making all this work so smoothly. And let me begin with a very quick introduction of my own. The word "we" will frequently be deployed today. That's not the royal we, it's Judy and me, and that's Judy sitting there. Judy's a botanist, I'm a historian. We met in 1959 in graduate school, and she helps me with my work, and I paddle her canoe when she goes after specimens in the Everglades. And she's very much a part of all of this. My assignment here is to take a comparative approach to the constitutional traditions of New Zealand. And I've written a paper. It's available in hard copy in the next room behind us. If you'd like to have a digital copy, send me an email, fisher@brandeis.edu. And when we get back to New England in September, I will be happy to send it to you that way. I'm not going to read the paper. It's too long. I'll talk about it. And in particular, though much of it is about what happened in the United States, in Canada. My next to last book was about Canada in this context, about Britain. I'm not going to talk about those parts. I'm going to center primarily on this country, on New Zealand. All of this is in the context of my work, which is about a comparative approach to open societies. And before I get onto the New Zealand story, I would like to say just a few words about open societies. It's a phrase that is familiar to, I think, most people here in New Zealand, as people connect it with Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and without agreeing to his views of Plato as enemy number one for open societies. I think there's something profoundly right about that book. Popper, an epistemologist, and it's an idea of open systems as requiring people within them to judge for themselves. Judge is the word that he used that way. Open societies began to be talked about in that ferment of thinking after World War I. There were quite a lot of other people writing books on the same subject. My favorite is Giovanni Amendola, who was a professor of political philosophy at Pisa University. And for him, as for Jeffrey, the open society, or he had other words for it, was not a conceptual model, it was a cause. And he was locked into a great struggle with his rival Mussolini in 1922, when things came apart. The American poet who said the world broke in two in 1922. His idea of an open society is very relevant to our business here. He was centered on the idea of law. It was said by people who knew him that law was for him a spiritual and even a magical idea. And he came at it in that way for his work, highly successful. Mussolini set his black shirts upon him, and they beat him so severely that he died of his wounds, a martyr to this idea. And there were many others as well. There was a considerable expansion of the number of open societies in the period after World War I, and they multiplied, depending on how you count, to something like 25 on the continent of Europe by 1930. By 1940, there were only 2 that were still surviving, only 2. And there was a sense of great crisis in the future of open systems. And then the test of the war in which this country and mine were engaged as open systems. And afterward, they began to grow slowly and painfully in the Cold War, and then much more rapidly from 1975 to about 1999. They more than doubled. We have an organization in Washington called Freedom House that makes it its business to take annual surveys of what they call free societies. It's what most people would define as functioning institutions with free elections, with respect for individual rights, with the rule of law. I think it's usually those 3 ideas. And Freedom House found that by the late 1990s, that open societies had become the modal system of organization for countries throughout the world. And they have, in their most recent study, find that almost a majority of people now live within open societies. And it was an expansion of considerable power. But then came the crash in 2007, and open societies began to shrink in number a little bit. Unfree societies began to multiply slowly, nothing like what had happened before. But we get a sense that in our own time, open societies, if we see the mass of these institutions, that these open societies are as strong or stronger than they've ever been. But in an individual way, they're also very fragile. Both the new ones and even the old ones in some respects. And the question is, for me, the operative question, is how we can strengthen these open systems in which I deeply believe. And one way to do that is to look at their diversity and to learn from it. And that's the purpose of this exercise. this morning, and in particular to look at New Zealand. And I'm going to approach it not as most people do, which is in terms of their institutions, but to think about open systems as constellations of value, as ideas. And these constellations are never twice the same. They overlap by the very nature of these open systems, but they also differ in very interesting ways. And I think one could say that diversity is apparent in the constitutional traditions of these societies, and then within those constitutional traditions to look at the values, which I think should be understood not in terms of anything like an ideology. These are more in the nature of customs or folkways. They're what Tocqueville called habitudes de coeur, that is, habits of the heart, habits of the heart. They are, in that way, very durable, but they're also dynamic, and they're extraordinarily complex and creative, and their creativity rises from the fact that so many minds are continuously engaged in rethinking them. So they grow in that way. They are deeply embedded in cultures, and they can be studied by an empirical method. And one of the great areas of progress in history today has been the development of methods for the study of vernacular ideas in these open systems. And I'd mention a few examples. One of them is a book by Stuart Schwartz. He's a historian of Iberia, of Spain, of Portugal, of their colonies in North America. And he wrote a book called All Can Be Saved. It was published at the Yale Press in 2008. And it's about vernacular ideas of tolerance and salvation in Spain. And the wonderful irony of this study is that he found a trove of materials on vernacular tolerance in the records of the Mexican and Spanish Inquisitions. These were people who shared that folk custom and practiced it with such strength and endurance that it drove the inquisitors wild with frustration. And they recorded much material. The book won all the major prizes in Latin American history, and it's having a huge impact in that field. There is a lot of work that's been going on in regard to the history of law and constitutional traditions. And yesterday, one of the leading examples, the work of Christopher Tomlins, he was referred to as Chris in the discussions yesterday. Shannon Dorset engaged his work. It's a book called Freedom Bound. It's published in 2010, and it's about vernacular ideas of law and labor and civic identity in what is now the United States. Another book that I've drawn on in that part of my paper, which is about the U.S. here, is Akel Reed Amar. It's called America's Unwritten Constitution. And it's very inventive in its invention of a multitude of methods for studying unwritten traditions. And some of the most important work of this sort is happening here, just now. And we heard some of it. I don't know, I think we broke apart for our meetings yesterday afternoon, and there was a wonderful paper by Mamari Stevens on this huge project of the reconstruction of Maori corpora, the corpus of writings that give us records of words, of ideas, in the general context of Maori constitutional thinking. And it's an enormous body of material that is, I think, in the process of revolutionizing our thinking that way. We heard it also from the paper by Karen Jones here in this room yesterday as well. We heard it from Miranda Johnson on one idea in particular, Kota Hitanga, and we can see knowledge growing here in particular regard to to Maori thinking, but also for Pākehā as well. What I would like to do is to describe what I've been doing, working first of all on Pākehā. I wrote a book called Albion Seed. It's about English migrants to America, and after it was published, I got a phone call from Raywin Dalzell, and she said, many people here think of themselves as Albion Seed. Come and talk. So Judy and I came down, and we talked at Auckland, and then traveled to, I think it was 6 other New Zealand universities on the same subject. As we traveled, we did what Americans love to do. We rented cars and hit the open road. And then we did what New Zealanders like to do, and we went tramping in the bush. And we began to get a sense of an extraordinary society here, similar in many ways to the United States, and yet profoundly different. But we couldn't quite put our minds around the nature of those differences until we were on that wonderful road from Akaroa to Canterbury. In, I think it was July of 1994, and there was an election underway, a by-election, and it was a time when the National Party held office by only a single vote. And a change, it was Ruth Richardson's seat, a change there would have brought down the government. And so the New Zealand media were out in force, and the parties made a maximum effort. And we were traveling back and forth through Selwyn on our various errands while the campaign was underway. And it looked very much like an American campaign. But it didn't sound like an American campaign. And again, we couldn't quite think why. And then suddenly it dawned on us that in the rhetoric, very little reference was made to liberty and freedom. These are ideas that are absolutely dominant in American political discourse. If our congressmen were forbidden to speak of liberty and freedom, a great silence would fall across the city of Washington. But even as those words were not much heard in Selwyn, we heard much about fairness, justice, natural justice, equity, but most of all, fairness. And we were struck by the fact that these were not merely discussions of fairness in particular ways, but of fairness as the central or a central organizing principle of an open system. And that seemed very different from what we know in North America. We do have political leaders who speak of fairness in North America. One of them is Mr. Obama. And Mr. Obama gave a speech yesterday on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's Dream Speech. And Mr. Obama centered his speech around fairness and freedom, thinking about a kind of interplay of those two ideas. We've had other American leaders who like to talk about fairness. Franklin Roosevelt did. Abraham Lincoln talked a lot about fairness. So also did Theodore Roosevelt and Harry Truman. But most Americans don't much talk about it, and some talk against it. I've given talks to American businessmen who tell me that fairness is for losers. They think that they hold with the view of some of our leaders, Vince Lombardi, the football coach of the Washington Redskins, who said that winning is not the most important thing, it's the only thing. And with eyes like that, with ideas like that, fairness does not flourish. And so we began to think about fairness and wondered where it came from and how these two societies planted by English-speaking people in different parts of the world could have moved apart in that regard. Well, the following year, we were invited to spend more time at Otago University, nearly a term there. And it was a wonderful experience working with Eric Olson and Tom Brooking, whose work touches this in many ways. And then one of the great delights for a historian perhaps not for other people, but it's the Hakan Library, which is an extraordinary institution. It's a manuscript library. It's filled with imprints from the very beginning of New Zealand's colonization by English settlers. And we burrowed happily, I burrowed happily, Judy went off to sea and for a while and into the bush again. But what I found was that I could read in the manuscript diaries of Bishop Selwyn there, much on the subject of fairness and justice. I couldn't find very much on William Martin, his friend in Parnell, in what is now Auckland. And I'm delighted that we're going to have a paper on Martin later today. But clearly, this first major judicial figure here in the English colonies was deeply interested in fairness. We also get into manuscripts and the writings of most of the leaders of the first so-called 6 colonies, except Auckland, which is not prominent in the collections in Dunedin. But the other ones had much material, and nearly all of those leaders, the Wakefields, Edward Gibbon Wakefield in particular, wrote a lot about fairness. That wonderful book called Swing Unmasked. His book comparing England, New Zealand, and the United States is very interesting. He didn't approve of the United States. He thought it was unfair. He developed this idea. It's interesting to see what a special meaning he gave to that. It was fairness without equality, but it was a very deep and powerful idea. We found it in the Godleys, and in the Burns family, and in the Taranaki mob. And most of them had come from a country in which they had some personal acquaintance with unfairness. They'd met it in any number of ways. And they, like the founders of the British colonies in North America, had that vision that's in the book of Matthew, that their colony was to be, as it said in the gospel, like a candle on a candlestick, like a city on a hill. And it was to be an example of a good society. In America, it was organized on ideas of liberty and freedom from the very start. And here, it was organized on some idea of equity, of justice, and fairness. So clearly, what we were hearing in Selwyn was not something that was specific to the restructuring of the late 20th century. This was something with very deep roots. And then after that, we had another invitation, and that was to do some teaching at Waikato University. Interesting to us, doubly so because of its connection with Maori. And then beyond that, for another remarkable library, a new library, in what was then the newest of New Zealand's universities. And there, the librarians had assembled a collection of ephemera, as they called it. And the ephemera included the manifestos and even the emails and other things of most of your major political parties. And so I went digging in that, and I found that nearly all of them had something important and even urgent to say about fairness. But they understood that idea in profoundly different ways. And the fascination was not merely the importance of fairness, but how very diverse that idea became when it was put to work in New Zealand. The parties on the right tended to equate fairness with individual rights, with some idea of liberty and freedom. The parties on the left, there was a time when the Labour Party had divided, and we got different versions of fairness from those different labor groups, but mostly it had some idea, some association with equality. And it was equality of condition for the old labor leaders, or it was equality of opportunity, it was a fair go for the younger labor leaders in that way. And we kept digging, and we found that many other parties got into this discussion with many different ideas as well. Maori were fascinating to me. They introduced their own ideas, and we found them in those ephemeral documents, as the librarians called them, and they're the words that we heard yesterday. Tika was one of the most prominent. But they did something else as well. They developed fairness on a different level. They thought about it as what we might call a meta-ethic. That is, They took fairness in the English, they urged Pakaha to give more attention to fair go as well as to tika, and they said of that this principle of fairness could be used to promote the coexistence of very different ethics. So it was an ethic that could reconcile different ethical ideas, and I think that was a very powerful and creative intervention, mainly coming from Maori. We found other people who were thinking about fairness as justice to individuals, very much along the line of John Rawls. And this came particularly from academic writers. We found opposite writings from Winston Peters. Shall I describe him as a very complex figure in New Zealand politics? But this idea of New Zealand first was an idea of fairness as a sharing of service to the nation. And I think that turned it in a different direction. We found the leaders of Christian groups getting into this great debate. And there is one group of 12 Christian leaders, the heads of denominations and other groups like the Salvation Army, and they said that fairness had been neglected or lost in the recent restructuring. And fairness for them, said, is something that can be measured and judged for a society as a whole by the condition of its least advantaged members. No political party adopted that idea, but all of those Christian groups did, and it was yet another aversion. We found the manifesto of a small, very small organization, which was a New Zealand fascist party. It called itself the New Zealand Neo Party for New Economic Order. And the party, the manifesto borrowed the Art Deco designs of the Third Reich, with one exception. There was the eagle, just as in Germany, but below, in the circle where a swastika had appeared, the circle was open. And the party leader explained that it was open because the New Zealand Fascist Party was in favor of fairness to Maori. That is to say, in New Zealand, even fascists had to engage this idea of fairness. And the question is, if fairness can mean all of these things, does it mean anything at all in its own right? Does it have an intrinsic meaning? And we went in search of an answer to that, and the answer we found was yes, absolutely. It has a very strong core of meaning. The idea of fairness is really interesting. First of all, in its language, the words fair and fairness exist in English, in Frisian, in Danish, in Norwegian, and in no other major language, Western or non-Western, until the late 20th century, when it would be introduced as a borrowing from English. It's something that's unique to the northwestern parts of Europe, and with a particular intensity in England. And we found uses of fairness. It has many meanings, but the ethical meaning was evident as early as the 9th century. The Venerable Bede was writing about fairness in the year 888. And as we looked into that, we found some interesting material in the Norse sagas on fairness. And these were tribes of very violent and predatory people. And they used fairness, I think, amongst themselves as a way of preventing them from destroying each other to the extinction of the tribe. It became a very functional ethic there. And I make a point of mentioning how powerful fairness was to Viking warriors when I'm talking to American businessmen. It gives them a different perspective on the uses of this idea. But it was a very limited idea. It was a tribal idea. It did not apply to their slaves or servants, and was uncertain in its application to Viking women, though Viking women were not uncertain about that. And they demanded to be treated with fairness. And the sagas tell us that more than a few warriors came home and made the mistake of treating a Viking woman as if she were a conquered province. And just as these Viking males were armed and dangerous, so were the Viking women. And it was the last mistake that several Viking warriors made in the sagas as we studied them. And then these ideas of fairness began to grow. But they remained the same in a kind of core. Always they meant not taking undue advantage of others in ways that we would object to if they were done to us. And there's that word undue, which I think was in most cases defined by custom and example and experience. And we find that that idea of not taking undue advantage of others is what fairness has meant from the Vikings to our own time. But it has changed in other ways. The first way it changed, I think, was with Christianity. And it moved from a tribal to a universal idea. But it moved very slowly. And when it came to New Zealand, fairness was often applied primarily in terms of fairness to Pākehā. And we see it operating within that kind of limit. And then it began to grow and began to reach out increasingly to Maori, and that sort of growth has continued and still goes on and is still incomplete in our own time. We found that in the 19th and 20th centuries, fairness began to grow all over the world. We did something like the studies that had been done on the corpora of Maori vocabulary, and used this wonderful new tool we have called Google Ngrams. I don't know if any of you have worked with it. I see some heads nodding. Google Ngrams is as accessible as any tool can be. If you want to know the history of a word, first in terms of its frequency, just call up Google Ngrams and type it in, and Google will develop a time series based on a corpus of literature, which you have to choose. It's available in most major languages today. There's a very large corpus of English language books published in England, 1 million English books, and we use that. Then there's an even bigger one for English publications, which is so big that Google can't put a number on it. It's called Lots of Books. We had a go on fairness, and fairness goes, as I said, all the way back, and then it's there at comparatively low levels, and around 1800 it begins to grow. And it surges to a kind of peak around 1840, and then it keeps growing, and it's growing today. And what we find is that fairness not only was that sense of not taking undue advantage, but it also meant it was something that was both procedural and substantive. It mostly applied to people who were in a condition of competition or conflict with other people, and was set within that frame. And as the world has become more competitive, the idea of fairness has become more useful, and it has spread and become a technical word in a great many applications. A good many of our learned disciplines and special professions have their own ideas of fairness. Negotiators have a code of fairness. The people who manage other people's money have an elaborate literature on fiduciary fairness. We see a literature on distributive fairness in many fields. A fair division is an abstract problem in moral philosophy. It's dealt with mainly in the equations of mathematical logic these days. And there's the fairness doctrine in American media law, fairness as natural justice in administrative law, though not so much in the United States, much more in Canada, in New Zealand, and in Britain. I was talking with the Chief Justice yesterday about that. She said, yes, fairness we think about, but it's difficult to manage in a court. She said we can manage it as a procedural idea, more difficult as a substantive idea, but it becomes manageable when we can think about it, for example, as inconsistencies of outcome and that sort of thing. and then a judge as competent as the Chief Justice can get her hands around that idea, and they're putting it to work. So we had a look at what happened to fairness in New Zealand. And the interesting thing was that it was put to work in very inventive ways. One thing about open societies is they ask most of us to be leaders in one way or another. I think everybody in this room has functioned as a leader. And these open systems also require that we lead in a particular way. I wrote that book about George Washington, who in the American Revolution found himself in command of an army of cantankerous New England Yankees, and he described them in letters home as a dirty and a leveling people. The New England Yankees wrote verses of Yankee Doodle about George Washington, and they're not sung by children today. And when these people tried to work things out, George Washington had to invent a new idea of leadership. He wrote home and he said, "A people unaccustomed to restraint cannot be drove," said this slave driver from Virginia. He said, "they must be led." And this is an idea of leadership to which we are all asked to respect when we lead, as I think actually literally most people in open systems do. And what's interesting to me, and I'll be brief, how's my time, Joel? Yes, what I'd like to do is just to show a few examples of how leaders in New Zealand, not individual leaders, but groups of leaders, put fairness to work. Every generation in New Zealand has done that. Not only fairness alone, there were other ideas here. Many people are talking about pragmatism in this culture. Americans think we own pragmatism. We think we invented it. I think it has different meanings in the two countries. The definition by Pierce and James Boyce, who developed this idea, was that pragmatism means that the moral value of an idea is to be judged by its use. And it's that more than the flexibility theme, which I think is strong here. But in any case, there's an idea of pragmatism which coexists with fairness. And those Americans who picked up fairness also are known as pragmatic leaders in America. I think there may be some way in which these two ideas link. We heard from Jeffrey yesterday, Jeffrey Palmer, that wonderful paper about Nelson. And in that great meeting in Nelson about ideas of self-government, about democracy, about liberty, all those ideas were there as well. But the driver in Jeffrey's story at the same time also had a highly developed idea of fairness. And they put them to work. And I'll just give you a few quick examples. In the first generation, I mentioned first a group of people who were, I think, as important as any in the history of New Zealand, but never came here. It would be the leaders in the colonial office. It would be Sir James Stephen and the others who worked with him there. And Stephen had an idea of fairness which was very similar to those Christian denominations that I mentioned in the late 20th century. He was himself an evangelical Christian, the Clapham sect, which was their parish church in London, and he described his idea of equity in the British Empire as, quote, a positive duty to guard the weak, to watch over the welfare of the many, quote unquote. Stephen, on that purpose of looking to people who are most in danger in various ways. His first act was, of course, to draft the statute that was the Slavery Emancipation Act in the British Empire in 1833. He was very active in promoting self-government in Canada. And then I think played, I think, the central role in the instructions that led to the Waitangi Treaty. I think much of that came from Stephen, and it also came from other figures. Edward Cardwell, who's one of the great reformers mainly known for his army reforms. But he actually drafted some of those documents that went out to Australia and then to Hobson on all of that. And that, I think, the driver there, I think with so much of that, so much of the work on why Tanguy focuses on problems of translation, which I think are secondary issues there. I think the primary issues are these constellations of value that were driving the treaty in the first place. And it's interesting to see that circle in the Colonial Office, which was contemporary with the Wakefields, both driven by an idea of fairness and equity and justice, and those two groups, the Wakefields and the people in the Colonial Office, loathed each other, as you know. And clearly they were thinking about fairness in very different ways. One was centered on the English colonists, the other, I think, mainly on Maori, and centered also on a more secular and a more religious idea, and many differences as well. And so some of these collisions between them became conflicts between two ideas of natural justice, of fairness, and these other values. And then we could go quickly to a look at the second generation. I'm fascinated by the abolition of the provinces, and we're going to have an interesting paper on that, on a theme that I've not seen developed before, coming today. But the period of the 1870s, and I've had a look at the people who I saw as the drivers, and it was Stafford again from Nelson, and it was Julius Vogel, and it was Harry Atkinson, one of the Taranaki mob, very conservative, and James Fitzgerald from Canterbury. And they thought about, they had been provincial leaders, they had risen in that system, and then they thought that there was something fundamentally wrong about the provincial system, and they made an effort to change it. It was highly successful, what they did. They talked about economic development. They talked about many things, but they spoke frequently about fairness. And they did it in different ways. When Vogel talked about it, he said the problem was that there was inequity amongst the provinces. He was thinking of the large and wealthy ones, so he was from Otago at that time, one of the largest and wealthiest. But he thought that there was a fundamental inequity there that was doing damage to New Zealand, in amongst other things, economic development. Stafford took another view from Nelson and that Chartist tradition that Jeffrey talked about yesterday. He said the important thing is not fairness to provinces, it's fairness to individual New Zealanders. And he was very interested in education and deeply concerned about the disparities in education throughout New Zealand, and thought that in other ways should be dealt with by moving beyond the provinces. And Fitzgerald was one of the few in that group, maybe we could say the only one, who was very much interested in fairness to Maori. And he spoke about that. And Atkinson was a more conservative man from New Plymouth, and he wanted what he called good and fair government, progressive and economical. And so 4 different ideas of fairness, and they put it together, and it was an extraordinary feat of leadership, I think, to abolish provinces. And then later, they and others would launch an effort to, first of all, to constrain, and then to abolish the group that met in this chamber, the upper house of the legislature. And what they did, I think, partly in the cause of fairness, was to apply a kind of constitutional equivalent of Einstein's axiom that everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. And they went to work on that, and were reducing causes of unfairness. How I wish we could do that in America. We have, in Washington today, I have a little section in the paper on 8 different dimensions of gridlock in Washington. 8 dimensions of gridlock. And I just want, could we abolish the Senate? Could we abolish our states? It's not only impossible, it's inconceivable. But it was done here. And I think part of the reason, only part, I don't mean to say it was all about fairness, but it was done here, and fairness was a little bit stronger. I'd like to talk about the Lib Labs. I'm told I shouldn't call them Lib Labs. They were mostly liberals, but they did take office by a kind of coalition. I'm told not to talk about coalition before M and P, but they needed they were 6 votes short, and they got them from the labor members. And so I think, so I'm told I can use Lib Labs, but I have to put it in shutter quotes. But they were an extraordinary group. And they had a major problem that separates New Zealand from Canada, from Australia, from the US. Our supply of land continued to be a driver of new land coming into the system for 16 generations, counting generations as 25 years. In New Zealand, it lasted 2 generations, from 1840 to 1890. And by 1890, New Zealanders were running out of land. And the question was what to do about the questions of fairness in that situation. Americans could keep alive an idea of a free society that could be ethically sustained by the continuing flow of abundance. But in New Zealand, it was very different. And so they launched an idea of redistribution. And it was the bursting of the great estates. And here, my friend and colleague, Tom Brooking, has done the major work on John Mackenzie, on the bursting of the estates itself. And what's interesting to me is that they were working with very complex ideas of fairness. This wasn't to be confiscation. It was to be a willing seller. It was to be a fair price. And the result was that the bursting of estates and that process of redistribution. And look at my map from Tom Brooking, and it happened all over this country. It was a big program. And it was generally accepted by most people as fair if they were Pākehā. But other lands had been taken by Maori without consent and without a just price. And some of that land was distributed to Pākehā as well. And so there was still a limit in the Lib Labs, which was within that still narrow circle of fairness to the European settlers. And the Maori were not fully apart. I think we'll know more about this when you know more about the land courts, this huge data set that's coming, that soon will be available, of materials that have never been fully used, but never used at all, many of them by historians, may complicate that story in really interesting ways. But here was another great group of leaders. They attracted progressives from all over the world to study them. If I had more time, I could talk about conservative leaders in the 1920s, and one of my favorite characters in New Zealand, who was Coates of Kaikoura, who faced what we center our thoughts on the Great Crash, and I think New Zealanders more in the long slump, but much of it in the 20s, and then in the 30s up to 1935, it was Coates who was driving much of that policy. And he worked out a solution to unemployment that was far from satisfactory altogether. But it was an idea of fairness in which he engaged leaders of other parties. He brought in business leaders, and he got labor leaders to agree. They agreed to alternatives to the American layoff, so that people would get part work instead of done at all. Of reduced wages, which labor leaders accepted so that more people could get paid. And the result by 1933 or so was that New Zealand had about 12% unemployed, a very high number. But the United States had 25%, Australia even more, Germany had 40%. And something went right in New Zealand in a terribly hard time. And it was a conservative leader with a very strong sense of fairness. And then those wonderful radicals who followed them, who were the Red Feds. It's as if in American history the Wobblies gained control of the federal government, except they went 2 very different ways. And the Red Feds and Savage, it's interesting to read the the memoirs that we're getting now from the people who were the senior civil servants who served under many prime ministers. And they said that Savage was in some sense the most able and the most Christian of all the people they knew in high office. And even more remarkable was Peter Frazier, who then carried, after 1940, this idea of fairness into the conduct of the war, into the UN, with extraordinary success. Winston Churchill and he often disagreed, and yet Churchill said, many of you will know that famous passage, in which Churchill said that under Frazier, New Zealand was the only country of the Allies that never put a foot wrong in the war, even when they put a foot in the wrong places as far as Churchill's policy was concerned. And we could go on into what's happened more recently and into the problems that are before New Zealand and most of the open societies in the world, the problems of inequality, the problems of the web, of surveillance, of so many issues today, which are often issues of fairness. And in all of these ways, New Zealand has more to teach the world than any nation, any other nation, in its intimate idea of the ways of fairness, in the experience that New Zealanders have of the corruptions of fairness, which would be the tall poppy syndrome, for example. And we can teach the world about liberty and freedom, and about the corruptions of liberty and freedom. The leading corruption is a person who thinks he has the liberty to take away the liberty of others. We've had a lot of trouble with that in the United States. And in all of these ways, I think we can, we each can learn from one another, and open societies throughout the world will be the stronger for it. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. So,
yes, we have, well, thanks first for that really wonderful lecture. We have around just 14 minutes for questions, which is very good, I think. So if you have a question, please identify yourself.
And shout them out. On my old ears are not what they should be.
Yes?
My question relates to the examples you've cited. I'm just going to that last list at the end of the speech. The only person there who was born in New Zealand was born in Coates. All the rest are born overseas. And I wondered whether you have a view on whether fairness can sustain itself when we have the example cited are all people who were born outside New Zealand and therefore presumably affected by what they saw as an unfair society.
Yes. The question, do I understand the question is about fairness in New Zealand with regard to people born outside New Zealand and issues in immigration policy in particular and after they arrive? Is that what you're thinking of?
Well, more perhaps whether people born in New Zealand and presumably subject to a fair society will want to sustain that idea in the same way.
If people born in New Zealand have similar ideas of fairness. I was struck by a couple of things that surprised me. One is that I believe that New Zealand has given people who were not born here more voting rights and at an earlier time than any other nation in the world. I think am I right about that? I think there is a period of disqualification, but it's much less than I think other societies, maybe any other society. And I think that's one clue, first of all, to the extension of fairness into relations between those who were born here and those who have have arrived. I think that New Zealand recruited its immigrants in a different way from the United States, and a large part of it was about the assisted process of migration. And I think there were maybe processes of unfairness in all of that. It was observed in the late 19th, early 20th century that New Zealand was harder to get into than some of the gentlemen's clubs in London in terms of the requirements for entry. And but at the same time, I think we can also see that the people who came to New Zealand went through a process of filtration, and so that often they had a particular interest in fairness. There's another set, besides the leaders of settlement, it refers to the immigrants themselves. And they would use those phrases like a fair field and no favor, that sort of thing. American immigrants were selected in that sort of migration filter for people who were very interested in liberty and freedom. And so we got two different groups, so I think that in some way the character of these societies reinforced the character of the people who continued to, or purposes of people who continued to flow there. I'm not sure that's responsive to your question, but let's talk after we're done.
Yes, just further to that question, it seems to me if you're asking the question about sustainability, which I think was part of the point of that question, don't you have to move to the next generation? And I would think it's useful to look particularly perhaps at David Lange and Helen Clark. Now, David Lange, whatever you think about his taking the cup of tea in the middle of the reforms, it was clearly motivated, I think, by worries about fairness and worries about the way in which economic reform was affecting the disadvantaged.
Yes.
And of course, you can trace that back to his early experience as a lawyer dealing with the disadvantaged in South Auckland.
Yes.
And similarly, I think with Helen Clark, the upbringing in rural New Zealand on a farm helped form, I would have thought, the egalitarian ideas that she has consistently promoted in perhaps a slightly different form. So I think if you're worried about sustainability, we are now producing Indigenous leaders whose New Zealand experience is leading them to a commitment to that sort of ideal.
Yes, I think that makes good sense. I understand all of this. I also think, though, that the reforms of Roger Douglas, when we compare them with the Reaganites, or with Mrs. Thatcher's group, had rather more concern for social justice, even as they were pushing for their market reforms. So I think there was a difference at the start that way. And then I also think that one of the really interesting things to me is that New Zealand conservatives, a good many of them, have tended to be different from conservatives in other countries in that they have been more open to some degree of compromise with some of these, with some of the issues of fairness. They're one of the great unpublished works of New Zealand literature, never found a publisher, was the autobiography of William Downey Stewart, a conservative from Dunedin. It's in the Hakan Library, awaiting an editor. And we can see something of this conservative thrust, this much more moderate conservative thrust. Not that there aren't radical conservatives in New Zealand as well, but a difference in proportion.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Hagee. With regard to the increasing globalization and what can be seen as Americanization, how do you think the next generation will be affected by this American rhetoric of liberty and freedom? And do you think that will have an effect on how New Zealanders conceive freedom and justice and fairness?
Yes. The question is, how would American ideas of liberty and what difference would American ideas of liberty and freedom make, and both in the world and in New Zealand?
They seem to be increasingly popular because America is such a large reach.
Yes. Well, I would say first that Americans have several different ideas of liberty and freedom. I went to work on those ideas, and I found I was looking for the meaning of liberty and the meaning of freedom embedded in the history of the words. And liberty was what I expected, the rights of independence, of autonomy. Freedom has the same root as beloved. It's the same, it shares the root with our word for friend. And I thought that's a very odd coupling in the way that Americans, some Americans think. And then I began to reflect on it, and I found when people use this word freedom sometimes, and also in its origins, it meant not the right of independence, but the right of connection, of belonging to communities of free people. And we English speakers are the only people in the world who get to have both liberty and freedom in our daily discourse. Most people will go one way or another. And I think that's a coiled spring inside of American culture. What's a right of belonging? It's the right to vote. It's the right to a seat in the bus. It's Martin Luther. It's the dream of the civil rights movement. And that's part of America that is caught up in all of this. But beyond that, as liberty and freedom spread, it takes on other meanings. And Judy and I were invited to China in 2007, the year before the Olympics, which I think is why the invitation came. I just published a book called Liberty and Freedom. It's a visual history of those words. And the Chinese government, the invitation came from the government to talk about liberty and freedom in China. And I was told that I could say anything I wanted, but the Chinese students could not say anything back to me about Tiananmen Square. And then we went, I think there were 7 universities in Guangzhou and then moving up north. And I would tell them about liberty and freedom. And a student raised his hand and he said, "Thank you for that. Thank you for telling us about Abraham Lincoln. Now we want to tell you about Confucius." And what they were doing was they were building, these were very free spirits, these young people. The women were the freest of all. After that question, then another hand went up, and it was a young woman who said, "Now we want to know what Judy thinks." This was an idea of liberty and freedom that would be developed in some not entirely clear relationship to the deepest, most deeply rooted values in Chinese civilization. We traveled on our own after we did some of this work. We went out to, is it pronounced Xi'an, Xian, in the west of China, not only the dynastic ruins, but there is a villa there where Chiang Kai-shek was held captive in, I think it was 1936. And it was a warlord who thought that if he could get Chiang and Mao in the same room, China might move forward, and that didn't work out. But Chiang was there for a while, and now it's a museum to Chiang in China. And it celebrates Chiang as a Confucian, as a man who was deeply educated in Confucian values. And the place was filled with young Chinese, and they're on their own, studying the roots of their society in the framework of a process of opening that will not ever look very much like the United States, but will move in yet another direction. And I would think I'd put my money on something like that.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering if, I was just thinking back to Carlin's example yesterday of Utu, and I was wondering, Carlin's example yesterday about the story he told about Utu and what Utu could look like in a particular framework of justice. And it seems to me at that point you're hitting the limit of what some people in New Zealand might see as an ethic or a principle of fairness comes hits a limit right at that point at which Carlin is talking about a very different notion of justice. I'm not sure that it's fairness. No, I don't think Utu is translatable as fairness. I might be wrong about this. Sorry, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think Utu is translatable as into fairness at all. Absolutely, as you pointed out. So I mean, I think that the problem that we face in a country like New Zealand, right, is that fairness is not going to help us answer those questions about how we live together in an occupied territory, if you like. I don't know. I think that's one of the conversations we're trying to have, but I'm not sure that fairness is going to get us there.
I think a fair number of my students would say equality would help us, but fairness is they think of fairness as a weak form of equality or something like that. Is that
well, I don't know that equality is going to be the right answer either, is it? Because the principle of Uta is not necessarily about equality either.
I think that one interesting thing about fairness, in the examples I would say, is that it, can you hear me? Is that it continuously is reinvented. It's an idea that grows.
Can you go back to the microphone, please?
It's an idea that grows. So I would say, don't give up on fairness. I think it has possibilities that we have seen in very unexpected ways. Maybe we can talk some more about that after.
We have time for one more question, I think.
Julian Ludbrook, in a sense it flows from the last question, but you made the interesting observation that we should perhaps spend less time worrying about the differences in the translation of the treaty and more on the constellations of values. And in a sense the question is, that sounds attractive, but how do you actually extract those different sets of values to interpret a treaty instrument?
So the question is about the treaty and about problems of translation and as against the constellation of values and what difference it might make to approach it in different ways. Is that roughly? And I would think that that when we look at the Treaty of Waitangi in comparative terms, I think we see a couple of things. One of them, we see that that we compare it with, let's say, loss of land in the United States, in Canada, Australia, and it looks to me as if, in general, we see similarities there, that almost everywhere the land was lost. And yet we also see that that treaty had lasting consequences, maybe particularly in its third article, which was about the full rights of a British subject was extended to Maori. There's a very interesting book by a man named Stuart Banner, maybe you know this, on it's a comparative study of the condition of indigenous populations in law around the Pacific Rim. And he looks at Maori, he looks at Aboriginal societies, but he also is, in Australia, he takes a particular interest in what happened in California, in the state of Washington, and in British Columbia. And what he found there is that in California, the indigenous people had no treaty rights to the land. It was almost totally denied. In the state of Washington, an early treaty was made by one figure, and it entered the law of the state of Washington. And the result is that the Indians in Washington have many of the same processes underway within the state, it's not federal law, that are similar to what has flowed out of the recommendations of the Waitangi Tribunal, fishing rights and that sort of thing. And all of that would tell me that the extension of the idea of rights, which came from, it was embedded in Waitangi, and as compared with, let's say, the United States, in most parts of the United States, where Indians did not become citizens of the United States until the Snyder Act, which was in the 1920s, meant that there were possibilities for at least some degree of redress. And it meant also that the choices that were made more than 100 years ago still make a difference today in very important ways for the Indians of the state of Washington. Some of the same things happened in British Columbia. So that's what I was thinking in terms of the values embedded in the treaty as having lasting consequences that I think are more important than the questions of meaning in the different texts.
Thanks very much. Just before we leave, for morning tea, just a few housekeeping matters. First, some delegates left their coats and umbrellas at the room at the back. So please remind to take them before you leave today. And second, the next, there has been a change to section 7, so concurrent panel 4, constitutional legitimacy. Instead of Edward Willis' paper, we will have Gay Morgan's paper on ingredients for a successful written constitution. And then I of course, wouldn't like to end before thanking again Professor Fischer for that wonderful lecture and that very interesting discussion. And if I may ask you to please join me again in thanking Professor David Hackett Fischer.